Welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and in this episode, we are going to be talking all about community building and DAOs, how to get into Web3 in the first place, diversity, and a number of other things with Caryn Tan. She is a DAO contributor at several different DAOs, including Clarity, Crypto Culture and Society, and Cabin DAO. And I'm so excited to talk to her about her journey to Web3, what her experience has been working in DAOs so far, and all the amazing insights that she has. So welcome, Caryn. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Diana. Excited to be here with you.
So for people who aren't familiar with you, could you start by sharing a little bit about your background before you got into Web3?
Yeah, sure. So prior to Web3, I had nothing to do with the crypto community. I had heard of blockchain back in 2015, but I was working in tech. So my focus in tech was around data and analytics for the first 3 years after I graduated from university. And then I moved more into looking at the ethics of AI and the role that it played in society.
Amazing. And then how did you initially start to learn about crypto and Web3? And what was it about crypto and Web3 that got your interest?
Yeah, so after spending about 5 years working in Accenture, which is a technology consulting company, I knew that I wanted to explore something different. And I'd always been really interested in more entrepreneurial ventures and always been really interested in community building and a variety of other things, which came together towards the end of last year. So I took some time off from my previous job. I was on a sabbatical and I was just exploring careers on the internet, looking at what a solo entrepreneur career might look like. And essentially just using a bunch of my different skill sets that I'd acquired over the period of my prior work and just seeing what that could mean for me as a next chapter. So I was an adjunct professor on the side of my previous work, and I'd been building curriculum and thinking about how you teach people about new and cutting edge technologies and how you build communities as well. And so one of the things I ended up doing as a freelancer was building a cohort-based course for a media guy. And the person I was building it with was really big into cohort-based courses and knew about all these online spaces and told me about this writing community called Foster. And it was through Foster that I met all these other people who were writing about the work that they were doing. And it just happened that many of them were DAO instigators, founders in the Web3 space, or building communities and thinking about similar topics to what I was interested in. And so it was through that lens, actually, through meeting people who I really vibed with, that I fell down the crypto and Web3 rabbit hole. Yeah, so it was actually the beginning of this year when I went out to Brooklyn to hang out with a couple of these people. And I met up with someone who was instigating or leading the strategy of crypto culture and society. And his name's Bomik. And he told me that they were looking for a community manager and whether I'd be interested to look into it. So I applied. And it really was up my alley, literally word for word. My Twitter bio was the job description. And then at the same time, a DAO tooling company, Clarity.so, had just raised a round of funding. And I met up with the founder and we had a really, really good chat about redefining the future of work. And so it was through these people that I met through a different community that really pulled me into the Web3 world.
I feel like that's the best way to get into Web3 is through the people. And it makes a lot of sense that you got drawn in by people and now you work with people primarily as your main role across all of these different DAOs. So one thing I wanted to mention is that you have a Mirror article that I found that kind of documents your process into getting into Web3 and goes a little bit deeper into sharing some of your inner dialogue that you were having with yourself and maybe some of your insecurities. You said that you really sort of felt like you lacked the confidence to dive headfirst into this space. And I feel like normally when I hear about people being unsure of themselves, if they can succeed in this space, it's from younger people, maybe people who are still in university or recent grads who haven't had a lot of experience or success. For you, when you joined the space, You had already been at Accenture, you had been an adjunct professor. You've, I think in the traditional sense of success, you've really kind of made it for yourself in the realm that you came from. Can you talk a little bit about sort of where those insecurities you had came from, given that you had already proven to yourself that you can be successful? So where was that doubt creeping in from when you joined Web3?
Yeah, I think it was a mix of two things. So the first is like, I was like so used to being, the youngest person and excelling at sort of everything that I had done prior to the point of, hopping into the Web3 rabbit hole. At Accenture, I was one of the youngest promotees. Like each time that I went out for promotion, I moved up to being a manager in like under 4 years, which like on average takes about like 6 years. And I built one of the earliest practices in industry looking at the ethics of AI, like quantifying the notion of fairness in algorithms. And these were all like, really cutting edge things that I was always like at the forefront of. And so like naturally have a curiosity and drive to chase, like cutting edge new things to explore and to like innovate and to work with other builders and operators. And Web3 seemed like, just the sort of right next move in that kind of, if those criteria hold true for me. Other thing is that the space is so filled with like such a varied sense of actors. Like I have never been in a space where you have to be like super careful about people actually being like malicious on purpose, not ignorant, and therefore causing unintended consequences, but like purposefully, phishing, scamming, very, very sophisticated attacks. And I just felt like every step that I took was like a potential step into like this pothole that I didn't know about. And so it was like a mix of feeling like I sort of missed the boat on being like the youngest in the space, but equally also thinking that everyone else has it together. Like everyone else came straight into the space, like knowing what a scam looked like what all these things look like. And so I think in some ways I just felt kind of very much like a boomer, which I don't think like by definition I am in this space. So yeah, that's where it like kind of crept in for sure.
Yeah, I can relate to that 100%. I too am a boomer by crypto standards, not by actual real life standards. But I sort of felt those same sort of things. And one thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I think you had to go through this and then I did too, less so with my transition to Web3, but more so when I left my job as a lawyer to travel the world and pull a really irresponsible move there and try to work online knowing nothing about any of that back in early 2017. I think one thing people struggle with when trying to get into Web3 is there are all of these like crazy titles and roles that people have. Like even if you just look at Web3 job boards, you'll see titles for roles that you've never heard of before in the traditional Web2 world. So I think for a lot of people, part of the challenge is also figuring out how do my skills transfer over into this new world almost.
Yeah.
What was that process like for you and almost rediscovering yourself as a community manager and somebody who has these community skills because you've never really held an official role as a community manager before you discovered Web3? And then what tips do you have for people who are going through that process right now and trying to figure out, how does my traditional consulting job, for instance, translate to the Web3 world? Or like I'm a lawyer in this space and I have these skills. If I wanted to contribute in just a smaller capacity in DAOs, like what are some other things that I can extract from my skill set where I can maybe contribute to the community or to contribute in a different way?
Yeah, that's such a great and broad question. So I think that for me, because like in the work that I had done prior, like I'd always been sort of like a chameleon. For example, I studied liberal arts in my undergrad and then I did a master's in management and then I joined the analytics practice at Accenture, like initially doing business analyst stuff and then I did some coding and then I ended up working on the ethics of AI, never having studied philosophy at university. And then I ended up like adjunct professoring for like technical subjects like data and AI at third year level for undergrads. And so like one thing that I had always carried with me and knew and hold to be true is that like you don't have to study the thing that you end up doing, which is the case for actually a lot of grads in the UK, like they'll study, languages and philosophy and then go and work at a bank. So if like a whole economy functions that way, like, that doesn't hold truth. And in the way that like kind of I've progressed with my career. So I knew that that was something that was like pertinent in industry. And I knew that like, because of the way that I got into Web3 was through people I knew who were like, yeah, you'd be really good at these things. Like I knew that that also held true in Web3. But I think the differences is that, to your point, like the titles are so different, and it can be really intimidating if you don't know the space and if you're kind of like quite foreign to it and maybe you don't know anybody working in it. So it's almost like there's a barrier that you can't break through because you don't know what the culture's like. You don't know whether the titles really mean what the titles mean, or whether like they're kind of mirrors of other tech worlds. So I think the advice I would have and some kind of reflections I would have would be for people who are thinking about how they translate their skills into this world if they're interested, is like thinking through, starting from where you are, like what are your strengths and what are your skill sets. And I also think it's quite important to take into account like the things that you enjoy and the things that like you can do at ease, like, and with flow. That seems to be, like your strengths. And then figure out like where they could map to. So for example, like a community role, to your point, I've known people who've come from like marketing background, from strategy background, from like a whole host of background. And because they have the skill sets that may not have been in a like traditional formal paid community role, they have a lot of skill sets that translates into it. So I think that's sort of how I would think about it. And then I would also say, because I had a few people ask me, how do I contribute to DAOs, or what are the things I should think about? I say to them, you should think about what your strengths are, like what mission you want to get behind. And then if you don't know what mission you want to get behind, then just kind of hop into a DAO and see what they're about, like see if you like the vibe. And then it's sort of like you just experiment and iterate. And as you kind of go into DAO, you gain knowledge about that DAO. And then you like make friends with people in the space, and then you kind of learn and move on. I think to the last question you asked about consultants, one of the good things about good consultants is that they can think pretty well, and the ability to think well and to be a strategist lends itself to kind of almost any role. So for example, at Clarity, I am thinking a lot about contributor experience, which has never been like a paid role that I did before. Like I've always been a strategist across the spaces. And then being a thinker and applying that to community building. So that's how I would say.
I love that. Yeah, I really like find a DAO or an organization where you align with their mission and their values. Mm-hmm. I think that's super key. And also, another thing I want to say too is I've met people in the space who are construction workers. For instance, like I have a friend who actually still is a construction worker. That's his 40 hours a week job. And then in his free time, he's a DAO contributor and actually a pretty core part of like a pretty core contributor to one of the DAOs. And so I would just challenge all of you too, like I think in some roles there are more straightforward transferable skills that you can pull out from your day job. But I think in other day jobs, like if you're like, oh, I'm a construction worker by day, like what transferable skills are there to anything in tech? There you can, identify skills in your personal life. Like what are you really good at in your day-to-day life with outside of work, like maybe with human interactions? Maybe you are really good at forming relationships with your coworkers. Maybe you're really good at managing your fellow construction workers. Maybe you're really good at being organized and making sure that everybody is on schedule and, getting things done at the right time. There are a whole host of things that you can extract from anything that you do, whether it's obvious or whether you have to do a little bit more digging. So I want to move on to some of the stuff that you're working on at the various DAOs that you're part of. And going back to the first DAO that you started working in, which is Crypto, Culture, and Society, CCS is a liberal arts DAO. So a couple of questions. First of all, can you talk a little bit more about what CCS is and what a liberal arts DAO does, because I think it's not immediately apparent probably from people who are hearing about this for the first time.
Yeah, for sure. So CCS, Crypto Culture and Society, is a DAO that's building liberal arts education for the crypto world on crypto. And so what CCS originated from was that Graham, who is the CTO of Mirror.xyz, he posted a tweet about how he was interested in creating like a reading group around like the more kind of cultural and societal implications that crypto might have on society. There were already other DAOs that were thinking of education, but more from like the technical smart contract side. So he was like, oh, what if we kind of more sat down and thought about like broader implications? And from my understanding, because I wasn't involved with it from the start, it blew up and then it became a crowdfunding on Mirror, and then it then became very quickly a DAO. And so end of 2021, semester 1 began, and then I joined just before semester 2 started. And so where CCS is right now is that we're building these semester-long communities where people can come together, like apply to join the semester, get accepted, and then purchase an NFT and take part in like a 12-week long community where you learn from these selected guest speakers who come in and talk about different aspects of the wider Web3 ecosystem. So we had, for example, in semester 2, Sirsu and Latasha come in and talk about like ballads and NFT in music. We had like Rafa and David Spinks talk about communities. We had someone who is helping build 2+ DAO talk about like the humane aspects of DAOs. So it's like people talking not just about like the smart contract side, but like kind of what are other things like that could impact humans and society and the way that, you know, we live and do our lives. So that's kind of what it does. And the types of people it attracts is like quite interdisciplinary. So we've had people come from like legal backgrounds, people who come from technical backgrounds who now want to interrogate more from like an anthropological, sociological lens. And the discussions like really vary from, you know, like the intersection of like engineering and tech and art all the way through to like, how do you apply kind of a more like anthropological lens to some of the questions that we're asking. So for example, one elective was called the history of NFTs. And the people who were based in New York went to some of the museums with the person who taught that class. So yeah, like a varied variety of like interdisciplinary topics.
That's awesome. And then your official title at CCS is Vibes Curator. This is obviously not a role that we would see in the traditional tech space or the traditional world at all. What does being a Vibes Curator entail? And kind of like, I'd love to hear like the whole story around it. Like, did you see a job posting for Vibes Curator and what was going through your head when you saw that? Did you understand it immediately? What drew you to apply to that? And what does your job look like now in that role?
Yeah, so the official title was actually social experience lead, but I thought that Vibes Curator sounded like cooler, so went with that. So 2 people actually told me about it. So a friend of mine who's very active on Twitter tagged me in it when CCS like did a post saying we're putting out this role for social experience lead. Does anybody know anybody who might, you know, fit the bill? And then Bomik, the strategy lead for CCS, was someone I knew from the writing community who I'd had like really good conversations about like ed tech and the future of thinking about education and online cohort-based courses. He also reached out to me about it. So then I applied for it. And the whole sort of intention of the role is put in a very simple sentence, which I really love, which is like the success of this person's role would be deemed by if you have been able to create friendships so good that they invite each other to their weddings, like in the future. So it's like, how can you incrementally move the needle on that happening at some point down the line? And so that was like the thing I had in the back of my mind when I was designing the vibes and curating for that throughout the semester.
What are some of like the best tips that you've learned from experience about how to help other people cultivate these relationships where they invite each other to their weddings?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've done that successfully yet. We'll have to, you know, there's like a long tail on knowing when and if that will happen. But I've learned so many things. I'm actually writing like a retro series on community building for a DAO. and covering like aspects from like prior to the DAO starting its season, like during season, and then core contributor communication, and then post-season kind of retro. So the key things I've learned I would say like top 3 things. So one is that like things that are really, really well designed are like super simple looking and seem like non-complicated. So for example, we thought quite a lot about our Discord flow and, you know, how people stage their way in through like emoji reacts and like even kind of the description and how many channels we had, and just thinking quite deeply about like how do we want to create a digital campus that really mirrors how we want people to feel, because, you know, Discord can be sometimes quite overwhelming. And so we had a lot of feedback actually afterwards where people said they really enjoyed being in our Discord and had like the right types of channels. For example, we had like a channel called Small Wins. So it's not, you know, to kind of shill yourself. It's just, oh, like today I nearly CC'd these people in the email, but thank God I BCC'd them kind of thing. Like, you know, like creating the type of vibe we want where you celebrate little things. So that's one aspect. And then other things that I've learned quite a lot about is just like how you create the notion of like small group feels in a really big community. There are ways to do that within Discord and also like with how you use your time. And then I think the third, and I think this is like a myth I am quite keen to dispel in the community building world, is that I think there is a lot of misconception around the role of a community builder as being someone who's like always moderating on Discord, always kind of like just being there, doing the things that don't scale. Strategic community builders are people who learn how to automate and operationalize things that do scale so that they have the space and the time to do the things that don't scale, which is actually just like quite beautiful when you think about like human interactions and like kind of building like bonds that you just fundamentally can't do with a bot. But it's like, how do you learn to, you know, make all the things that can scale, like be automated so that your time is spent doing those other things?
Okay, that's really fascinating. Can you dive into that a little bit deeper and maybe talk about from a more practical standpoint, like maybe at CCS or in another DAO that you're in? What does that actually look like? What are the parts as it relates to community building that can scale, and how do you scale them? And then what are the parts that cannot scale and you have to spend more of your time on?
Yeah, so I'll walk you through like kind of high level how I built community here and the kind of methodology I'm kind of lifting and shifting to other communities. So I took a lot of the thinking that I have learned more from like strategy and also product and kind of applied it here. And so when I interviewed for the role, there was like a bunch of different questions, like what are some principles you take with you when you design communities? What are do's and don'ts? And for me, it was like quite simple that like there is a framework to be applied here, which is that when you build a community, there are aspects of like building a community which is very similar to thinking about like managing a product, where you have personas that you're catering to, and personas are people who are attracted to community in the same way that personas are people who may be attracted to a product or service. And so you would think about like what are those personas and what are the journeys that the personas go on. And so in building the persona journey, you are essentially trying to map like what are the stages they go on? Are there kind of like, are you trying to get them closer to like something? Is it that you want to make them a contributor, or is it something more like ephemeral? And are there pain points and also like parts where they feel like really positive emotions throughout that journey? So building the persona journey, I think that one, like it takes a bit of like time doing like qualitative research and understanding. But once you get to a point where you can build like a pretty good journey, and if your community is like catering to the similar types of people, so if you're like building closer and closer towards like community market fit, you can then say, okay, like I think these 4 or 3 or whatever are the personas I'm locking into. And this is typically where they feel like the pain points, the lows and the highs. And so rather than thinking about community as being just these like bunch of people like milling around in Discord, you're now thinking about them as like personas that are going through this journey. And obviously there are aspects of generalization if you're just trying to do it to like 3 or 4 personas, because obviously everyone's like different. But if you kind of go for the 80-20 rule, then you know that like you're hitting like the pain points and the high points. And so you can cater to those in a kind of scalable way. Because once you say, okay, I think like 80% of the people feel pain point here. For example, if they're new to Web3, new to Discord, it's overwhelming at the very start. What are things you can do? Maybe you do like an onboarding call for all of them, like, and that like dispels that problem there. So building the journey out and then iterating on that, and then kind of like getting to a point where you're like, okay, this is, I think, like the blueprint for how my community works. And then once you know what those points are, you can scale up those activities. So for example, one of the things I knew was that when people came into a community, they wanted to meet other people. So when the applications came in, rather than like trying to figure out, okay, like how do I get different people to meet, I kind of combined like my strat ops hat, and I took like the application that came in, and I essentially just like created these like massive Excel formulas. So I was like reading through the different tell me about yourself answers. That part non-scalable for now. And then every time an answer had like a keyword, for example, say like marketing or community or edtech or VC, I would create like a new column for it. So it would be like the VC column, and then it would be like, search this column. If you find this word, like flag yes. And so essentially I had like all these categories of different interests. And what was cool about it was that I just used the Excel formula, and then it just like filled it all out. And then we took that into like a directory for the community, and then people found each other using that. And so I think it requires a little bit of kind of more hands-on work at the start. But then in future, if I use the same formula, I don't have to do what I did before, provided that, I've iterated a couple of times and improved what I'm building out. So yeah, there's like aspects of it that can be scaled up, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I'm so fascinated by that. I think that's so smart. I haven't heard anybody else in this space talk about community building in that way yet. And I think it's super clever, and really makes sure that, you're not just being like a customer service bot on Discord, and that you're actually thinking about strategies to grow your community and grow it in a way where the people that come into the community are actually values aligned and vibe with the existing community. I think that's super smart. Okay, cool. So I want to get into Clarity a little bit too, because Clarity is another project that you're working on as well. For people who don't know, first of all, what is Clarity?
Clarity is a Web3 native tool for DAO contributors to get onboarded into the DAO ecosystem and into a DAO specific, get work done for that DAO in an asynchronous fashion, and then get rewarded for what they do through payouts and contributor reputation.
From my perspective as a user of Clarity, it's kind of like a Notion and an Asana in one, but with Web3 capabilities of being able to log in with your wallet and pay out contributors through the platform and things like that, which is a pretty powerful tool.
I can see how that's a way that might be framed in one's mind around like.
Oh no, I explained it wrong. Richie's gonna kill me.
You didn't. I think a lot of people explain it that way back to us, and I guess we like to think of Clarity as being sort of within its own category of being able to do contributor experience really well. So shared task boards, shared docs, gated by tokens, and then being able to pay it out, through mainnet, L2s, and testnet like rewards. And there are many other aspects of Clarity that has like backlink functionality, which is more similar to like Roam and Obsidian. When you think about like email with like lots of CCs, like over time, and you like look through the history, imagine that, but like only relevant stuff whenever you click on certain subjects within Clarity. So it's quite like a powerful tool in being able to enable DAO native contribution, as well as like a bunch of other things that Notion and Asana don't have.
Yeah, 100%. I think that tagging, I think you're talking about the tagging feature on Clarity, and that is super powerful. We're still trying to streamline our tags and figure out which tags are the most important to us and make sure that we're staying consistent with using those tags. But yeah, 100%. I think that's a really powerful feature. So you mentioned that you sort of lead the contributor experience at Clarity. Is that similar to what you do at CCS as the Vibes Curator, or does that look different?
It looks quite different. So at Clarity, I am thinking very deeply about what it means for a contributor to contribute to a DAO. and what are the aspects of contributing to a DAO that is very different from the way that one might work in a corporation, either as a full-time employee or as a freelancer or building one startup. There are aspects about working in DAOs and in Web3 that modularizes work in a way that we have never really seen before. And that then brings with it a whole suite of challenges that Web2 tools are, fundamentally not capable of catering to. And so I think quite deeply about what it means to be a contributor, where the challenges are, what the pain points are, and how Clarity as a tool can cater to that. And what are ways I can surface some of those pain points and challenges back to Clarity. So I focus a lot on how we can help contributors adopt Clarity as a tool. And then as a result of kind of my being very close to these contributors, it's almost like a byproduct that I'm creating a super user community around the people that I'm engaging quite deeply with.
Got it. Okay. So I need to have a separate chat with you about Rehash then, because we really want to use Clarity, but I think we're still newbies. So I think there's a lot to learn about how powerful the tool is. Okay. So I'll sidebar that with you. Sort of wrapping this up, what would you say, looking back now, are some of your high points and some of your low points or pain points to working in DAOs now that you've been in this ecosystem for almost half a year, which in crypto years is 5 years basically. So how would you summarize some of those high points and low points?
I think the high points is I've really enjoyed working with people who I think very similarly to the way that I do about the possibilities of the future of work and how it relates to autonomy and being able to work on very interesting but disparate topics. So, you could contribute to, for example, me, to a liberal arts DAO, and then to a writers collective, and then to a tool that's being built for the DAO ecosystem. And that's welcome, and that's, highly celebrated and encouraged. And then meeting really incredible people and having had the chance to actually spend a lot of time with them in real life, and hopefully, we'll get to meet in New York soon. So those are all the really high points. I think two main pain points, which actually also ties back to a high point, is asynchronous remote work is really awesome for flexibility, but if you aren't careful with it, it can kind of consume your whole life. So because I started in the DAO space mid-Feb, and I think from Feb to maybe late April, I was really on Discord at very late hours, mapping to Eastern time. I'm based in Europe. So realizing that wasn't really good for my health was something I've had to pull back from. So I think that's kind of the main thing. And then the other thing, which is a can of worms that I will end on, and we can leave it there. One of the things that we as regens in Web3 are excited about is that, you can exit to community and you can build community-based, either cooperatives or decentralized organizations. But I do wonder, what the financial viability of that really is for people. For example, I'm in a really fortunate position where CCS was 1 gig that I had on the side of working for Clarity, which is has seed funding. But if it weren't for the kind of permutation of roles that I have, I don't think I could be a full-time DAO contributor. And I know that a lot of people in the DAO space are thinking through this financial model of a lot of VC money coming in, and whether to take that or not, and what it means for the ecosystem that we're trying to build in a regenerative way. So I'm thinking a lot about that and kind of trying to figure out what it means in the longer term.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to all of that. And one other thing too about async work, which I am overall a huge fan of. I love the freedom and the flexibility that comes with it. But I think another challenge that I've experienced with async is that a lot can get lost in communication when you're working with people that you don't know. At this point, we've chatted a couple of times. We've had some interactions. I think, at this point, if you were to send me some messages, we would probably be on the same page, or at least I wouldn't take any of your messages potentially the wrong way. But when you're working with people who you don't know and who come from different backgrounds as you, maybe different cultures, there's maybe a language barrier a little bit, and you're just sending async messages or maybe async commenting on documents and things like that, I think there's no tone whatsoever in, Google Doc comments or in like text messages or Discord messages. And so I think a lot can be misunderstood or just taken maybe the wrong way, which can cause conflict and disputes, which we sort of co-worked on an article that Rafa wrote on that exact topic. But yeah, that's for sure a challenge as well with the async. And I really think in a DAO setting or in any remote work setting, really that over communication is so important. Like I always say, if you feel like you're over communicating, you're probably just communicating the right amount. And if you feel like you're communicating the right amount, you're probably not communicating enough in like a distributed remote setting, because you really do have to provide that extra context, I think. But one other thing too that we haven't really talked about yet with regards to community, I know this is something that you care about and it's important to me as well. It's one of our core values at Rehash is diversity. It's a topic that I think we have to consciously talk about and talk about it separately, because we're so far away from being able to build diverse communities organically that if we're not conscious about building diversity into our communities and organizations, it just won't happen on its own. What are some of your thoughts or experiences about building diversity into community? Has it come to you pretty easily, or have you had to make a big effort? And I also hear people say like, oh, I want more women in my community, but I just don't know where to find them. Like, where are all the women? Or how, like, for people who are like, everybody in my circle is, a white male. Like, where do I even go to find diversity? Like, what tips do you have for building diversity into your communities?
Yeah, that's a hard one. So I worked on this topic when I worked on the ethics of AI. It was like kind of fundamental to what we were thinking about, because we essentially within that space wanted to ensure that we didn't exacerbate systemic inequalities that were already prevalent. And we wanted to kind of, work on ways to even like improve that. So I think that for improving diversity in communities, it's kind of realizing that we all have blind spots. Like, even if you are like, in the minority representation, like, a woman of color, there may be privileges that you have been given that causes you to have blind spots in areas. Like, I would have blind spots discussing disabilities, discussing like, aspects of gender nuances that I'm not very versed about. But being open-minded and being ready and willing to like learn about it, and also having allies in the space is really useful. So I have friends who, know about some of these topics that I don't know much about. But I think it's also about being careful not to go to a woman and being like, oh, we're looking for more women. Can you, like, where can we find them? Because I think that then kind of puts the onus back onto the person who is, not well represented, who is minoritized, who has been marginalized, to do the heavy lifting for the person who never had to really think about it and is now like, oh, this is something I need to worry about, whether they actually care about it or whether it's like, I need to worry about it because it's become like a baseline political correctness that I have to adhere to, right? So I think it's like having allies, but also being like, if you really do want women in your community, like being willing to go out there, find them, DM them, like being willing to go into allied communities to like figure out how you can sponsor them, put your money where your mouth is, and really like getting involved in those conversations, even if it makes you feel really uncomfortable and, and feel really clueless about the space. Like, I had a very similar conversation like this with friends who identify as like non-binary or like queer. And I realized that like I needed to do the education myself. Like, I can't rely on them teaching me, because it's, again, what I said about putting women in that sort of seat of burden. So that's how I would think about it.
I love that. Yeah, 100% echo everything that you just said. I completely agree. So to wrap up every podcast episode, we always end with a fun little game. It's called This or That. And how it works is I'll just say 2 words. I'll say A or B, and you tell me which one you prefer. There's no explanation needed. It's just really quick lightning round. And I've got 10 pairs of words. Are you ready?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So the first one is Bitcoin or Ethereum?
Ethereum.
Crypto or Web3?
Web3.
DAOs or NFTs?
DAOs.
Bear market or bull market?
Bull market.
Writing or editing?
Ooh. Writing?
Books or podcasts?
Books.
Skateboarding or longboarding?
Longboarding.
London or New York City?
Oh my God. London.
Okay. Past or future?
Ooh, future.
And then last one, Earth or space?
Earth.
Okay. All right. Good job. You were great at this. You wouldn't believe how much people struggle with this game. Well, thank you so much, Caryn, for taking the time to come on the podcast and sharing all of your insights with us about community building. I know I learned a lot, and hopefully all of our listeners did as well. Before you go, just tell people where they can find you if they would like to follow you personally or reach out with some questions or a nice little message after the podcast. And then also where people can go to learn more about CCS, about Clarity, about any of the other projects that you're working on right now.
Cool. So I'm active on Twitter, 0xCaryn, spelled Caryn. And in my bio, you can find the Twitter links to Clarity, CCS, and Foster. So that's where I'll be.
Awesome. And we'll include all those in the show notes as well to make it easy for people to get there. Thanks again so much, Caryn. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll be back again soon with another episode of Rehash.
Thanks so much, Diana. See you later.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. The guest from this episode, Caryn, was nominated by Karsten and voted onto the podcast by Caitlin, Diana Chen, Tyler Internet, and Ellie Dots. Some of the questions you heard were submitted by Karsten. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, and as always, supported by Rehash DAO. To stay up to date on all things Rehash, you can follow us on Twitter at RehashWeb3 and join our Discord to get involved.